cousin Ray passed away in a house fire last week. James' nephew Stephen has been diagnosed with cancer. Evie Sullivan, whose coma is now home. Good news there. Looks like there's going to be sledding at Keep the Cherries today at 4 o'clock. Me and my boys will look forward to that. Any other announcements or anything that we should make mention of?
Frank Phelps is a teacher at the middle school. He's diagnosed with cancer.
Frank Phelps, a teacher at the middle school, was recently diagnosed with cancer. I guess one other kind of administrative thing before we get into the lesson today. I think we made mention of this a few weeks ago, but definitely due for a reminder that we are planning on, at the end of this class, having a congregational meeting February 4th, which is not next Sunday, but the Sunday following, to kind of discuss plans for submitting names for those that would be qualified for elders. We'll maybe talk through a little bit more of that process here during class, but just want people to be mindful that in 2 weeks we will have a congregational meeting directly after services for those that can attend and plan to kind of discuss a plan from there. I think in preparation for that, Richard is also going to be preaching next week on eldership, church leadership. So look forward to that as well. Anything else administrative announcement-wise? Okay. We last week we started talking about the question of how did churches get elders in the first place, and we looked at a couple of examples of where Titus and Paul and Barnabas were going around to appoint elders. And essentially, in that discussion, we pretty much came to the point that there's really not a lot of scriptural detail or information about, a step-by-step process. Really, kind of all we had from Scripture was that it was godly men that were at that time traveling around to congregations to appoint elders from within the congregation. So that means for us today that I believe we have flexibility to accomplish that really however it is deemed appropriate by the congregation. We, in this process, would want to be mindful that we are not, we're approaching it, I think, in a thoughtful way, in a way that doesn't promote division or isn't, I guess, counter to any other scriptural ideas. I think, unfortunately, this process can, I think, at times be a difficult one, in that we are going to be putting forward names publicly. There are, at at times, well, I would say this is a time where generally people are being looked at and considered for qualifications, and I think during this time it is just something to be mindful that we should be approaching it in love, that we should be approaching it in a way that is not overly judgmental or putting people in uncomfortable situations. So I guess with some of that said, we'll start off today with looking at the example in Acts chapter 6, verses 2 through 6. This is early in the church after Jesus has left, and the apostles are really the key players that are going around and teaching and preaching, setting up churches. Going around teaching, preaching, setting up congregations, and they are going to appoint men to a specific task so that the apostles can focus on the teaching and preaching. So this is not necessarily an example of appointing elders. However, it is, I think, a good example of men being appointed to a task, to some leadership role within the church, and kind of gives us a good discussion and good kind of example of what this might look like. So we're going to be in Acts chapter 6, verses 2 through 6. When someone gets there, if they don't mind reading that, chapter 6, 2 through 6. So that.
And the 12 called the multitude of the disciples unto him and said, it is not fit that we should forsake the word of God and serve tables. Look ye at, therefore, brethren, from among you 7 men of good report, full of the Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. But we will continue to steadfast in prayer and in the ministry of the word. And say, please, the whole multitude, and they chose Stephen, a man of full faith and Holy Spirit, and Philip, and Pyrrhus, and Nehemiah, and Timon, and Parmenas, and Nehemias of Antioch, whom they sent before the apostles, and they had prayed that they lay their hands upon it.
Thank you. Sorry about those names. I forgot about those. So what I left out of that reading probably would have been better to start off in verse 1. So the matter at hand, well, I'll just read verse 1. In those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Grecian Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So we see a pretty specific issue or task prompting this need for these men to be appointed. The widows of a certain heritage were being overlooked in the distribution of food. So that prompts this process for the 12 apostles to appoint these 7 men. So just in terms of the process of appointing, who does the 12 apostles go to and say, request that the men be chosen by?
student disciples.
Yeah. So I had mentioned that the first examples we saw were of certain men traveling to congregations who would have not been immediate members and appointing members, so kind of outsiders coming in to appoint. But here we see the example of the 12 saying, brothers, or the multitude, the collective group being the ones to choose men to put forward for this. And what do we see the qualifications here for these men? What's required for them to be considered? This is in verse 3.
Good reputation, full of the Spirit, and
Yeah. So it's interesting to me that we see this is kind of an administrative task. You know, it seems like, in my mind, this would be something would be accomplished by someone that's good at keeping a list and getting addresses or however the food would have been administered. But the qualifications are, I guess, maybe not directly tied to this administrative sort of task. The qualifications are for men to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. And so here we see, again, kind of a emphasis on these men being good Christian men, demonstrating, values that go beyond, I would say, just the task of getting food handed out to the widows. And what was the main purpose for these men to be appointed?
We'll see that distribution.
Yes, yeah, to see the distribution, and I guess what would that accomplish for the apostles? Why wouldn't the apostles just handle this? Right. So I guess the reason I kind of call that out is I think that's a good lesson for what, in general, leadership of God's people should be. I think here we see kind of an example, and then as we get into discussion of the roles between elders and deacons, we see really the primary focus should be teaching, spreading the gospel, and then these administrative tasks are handed over to people to get accomplished so that everyone is focused on what they need to be focused on. I think it's kind of just simple division of labor and good, clear communication being a good or necessary for any well-run organization. I think with good leadership allows for the focus of preaching, spreading the word, and the accomplishment of physical needs. So for us today, I think so in this passage, there's really no title associated with these 7 men. It's not said, there's really no correlation of the Greek language between these men being deacons or elders. But I think from the context and from comparing them to the roles that we have more clearly defined between elders and deacons, these certainly would seem to fit with the role of deacons, the role of servants that are given sort of a task to oversee, to accomplish, have that efficiency and that somewhat of autonomy to just accomplish tasks and not bog down a larger group, allowing them to not have to all be involved in that process and just freeing up time, decision processes to be more efficient. Any other points or comments from this example of appointing the 7?
I'm just struck by not the administration so much of it, but the fact that the church, while the apostles were there and leading, had issues, had problems, and maybe even a significant problem. Seemingly, there was a group that was being, for whatever reason, overlooked. Whether it was racism, for whatever reason. So there was possibly even a significant issue that the church dealt with. Sometimes we're hard on ourselves today because the church has whatever issue. We're human. There's going to be issues. There was issues. There always has been issues. There probably are. And we can work to mitigate those as best as we can and to work in love to overcome issues. But I was just struck with the fact that there was a significant problem here while the apostles were leading the church.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I think, here they strove to, I think, solve that through a good leadership structure. And I think that kind of speaks to some of the reason that congregations, us here today, should strive for a good biblical leadership structure. But to your point, even though they had the leadership of the apostles at that time, they still saw issues. So I think good leadership will certainly help a congregation. It should provide structure. It should provide efficiencies. It should empower leaders to accomplish things that maybe otherwise would be harder to accomplish. But to your point, we are still human, and it may not always solve everything. And I think if leaders are put in place, it's important to not become complacent with those leaders and to for leaders to hold each other accountable and for congregations to be involved as they were in the decision-making process, to be invested and engaged in discussing with leaders. Any other points, comments, questions from Acts chapter 6? So, as I mentioned before, we don't see a scriptural step-by-step, do this week, this the next week, and then you'll have elders. I thought we'd take a little bit of time today to kind of discuss generally what we are proposing for our congregation today. So, as mentioned at the beginning, we have a congregational meeting scheduled for a couple of weeks from now on the 4th. We've tried to, through this class and through Richard's lesson coming up, provide people some background, some information on what should be considered for men to be qualified. And then at that meeting, we will essentially pass out papers for people to submit names for those that they would like to see become elders. Now, we could do this at the same time of soliciting names for deacons. It's kind of been decided at this point that we would focus on elders. My plan is to kind of, after we get through the study of elders, to spend a week or two focusing on the role of deacons and what their task would be and how they would be appointed. So the plan is for now to focus initially on appointing elders. So in this soliciting of names, we will basically be providing papers for you to write names down. But I think in keeping with what we see from Scripture, this process of writing names down is not simply a voting process, which it can be confusing because there are similarities between writing names down on a ballot and just a simple majority. Because in this process, we would want elders to have a significant amount of support. But I think it's important that simply someone's name being written down does not mean that they would be voted into the task or the role of eldership. So as names are selected or are submitted, those of us that would not be qualified will compile those names, and part of the process will be going to the men that have a significant amount of support from the congregation that, as far as we can tell, meets the qualifications. And we would meet with those men and give them opportunity to say whether or not they desire the noble task of being an elder. And if they also feel that they are qualified, we would bring those names that have significant amount of support back in front of the congregation. Make those names public, and give some time for people to continue to, evaluate their comfort level. If people have concerns or questions at that time, I think it would be first appropriate for those members to go to the individual directly and discuss any questions or concerns. And then if it's not resolved that way, we can I guess, make a path sort of clear of who they should go to with those concerns, and we would work to resolve them in that way. I would also just say that in Scripture we see there's always a plurality of elders when appointed. So I think for this process to go through, we would have to have at least 2 or more that are qualified and willing. And we discussed a little bit last week that although it is I believe God's plan and design for congregations to have elders, that it is not necessarily a requirement. So if in this process we find that we are not in a position to have a plurality of men that are qualified, this does not mean that we have to appoint at this time. Yeah, I guess that's, just generally some of my thoughts and some of the discussions that we've had in our men's meeting about how this process would look as far as appointing today. And again, we'll be reviewing this over the coming weeks. Certainly we'll review it again in our congregational meeting. But just on this topic of appointing leaders, just wanted to kind of give that overview. Any questions or anything that I missed?
Something you want to appoint elders. What are the specific duties of the elders? What do we expect of the elders?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so the rest of the class today will be looking at qualifications that I think kind of indirectly gets to that. But after the week after that, I'm hoping that we can look at scriptural examples of what the elders are doing. But generally, I would say elders are, just from their titles, they're overseers, they're shepherds. So their primary role seems to be focused on feeding the flock spiritually. They are tasked with teaching, they're tasked with being hospitable and caring and gentle. So at a very high level, I think they are tasked to focus on providing for the flock, however that may be, through organization, through physically teaching, preaching, meeting with people. So, good question. I hope we answer that more this week and coming weeks. But I'll open that up to the room. Any other comments on the role, the task, really why we should seek to appoint elders? Yeah, we might get some more discussion on that as we get into qualifications. Yeah, good question.
I think like you said, you're talking general, like you did just now.
Yeah.
Maybe just organization and direction.
Mm-hmm.
At least to start. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
generally, that's what it's gonna be, that's what they needed to hear. They needed some organization, because some people maybe didn't realize that, oh, we're missing a complete section of people over here. So that is the direction of the congregation. How that's done, I guess we'll get into, but
Yeah,
those two words.
yeah, and I think one other thing off of that point is that, so these 7 men that were appointed to oversee the feeding of the widows, there was nothing stopping them from, before they were appointed, to oversee this feeding. But I think with the specific charge, with the task that they are given, there's a certain amount of empowerment, of ownership, of encouragement and accountability that comes with a specific role, a specific title, if you will. And I think that's certainly something that is beneficial for a congregation. I believe that we have men now that are qualified and in some ways already filling some of the roles of an elder. But I think without the, what's the word I'm looking for? The making it official, I think there will always be a little bit of natural and good hesitancy for people to feel that they're overstepping or feel that they are, it's not their place to make decisions or even just do some work. And so I think this title, these roles, I think are good for accountability, but also this empowering and allowing people to fully step into the work that needs to be done.
I think to your point, we have men now that do ownership duties.
Mm-hmm.
If they get appointed to an eldership, I think it brings the backing of the whole congregation behind them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just one, everybody's actually behind them. You trust them to do the right thing all the time.
Yeah.
That's a good point for ownership. You can pull that in conversation with congregation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I think the support of a congregation is just as important as elders leading a congregation. It's both. A good point. Good. All right, let's get into the two key texts that we'll be going through. They're very similar. They are Paul's instructions to Timothy and to Titus. So both of these passages really serve the same focus, but just with slightly different audiences. Towards the end of chapter 3, Paul tells us and Timothy the purpose of these passages. It says, I'm writing, and this is a slight paraphrase, but this is chapter 3, verses 14 to 15. It says, I'm writing to you so that you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God. So we are going to be focusing now on the passages that directly pertain to this role of elders, overseers, shepherds. But both in Timothy and Titus, there is a larger discussion about roles for essentially all Christians within the congregation. And we're going to be looking at a subset of this. So on the sheet, I printed off, or I recorded the passages that we're going to be looking at in two translations. I just chose the NIV and the New King James. so that as we go through these roles, you can kind of see a couple of different wordings that I think help give a little bit of context to these qualifications. So if someone would be willing to read 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7.
Faithful is saying, if a man seeketh the office of a bishop, he deserves his work. The bishop therefore must be without reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, orderly, given to hospitality, like to teach, no brawler, no striker, be gentle, not temptatious, no lover of money, one that ruleth well his own home, having his children in subjection with all gravity. But if a man knoweth not how to rule his own house, how should he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up and full of the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, must have good testimony from them that without, lest he fall into reproach and snare of the devil.
Thanks. So it's not a short list of qualifications. After reading this, if someone would be willing to kind of put in your own words, what kind of man do you think Paul is telling Timothy to be looking for in terms of someone that would be qualified to be an elder?
Short answer, godly man.
Godly men. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, that really most of these, almost all of them, are really who all Christians should be striving to be, right? We all should strive to be above reproach. We all should be self-controlled. None of us should be violent or quarrelsome or greedy. And so I really like that answer, is that it's someone who is walking the walk. Someone that is, I think generally people would look to and say they are good examples of what a Christian should be. That said, no one is perfect in this. And so that's one thing that in this discussion of qualifications, it can be challenging because no one is going to, and I believe, fit the bill perfectly every single time, every single day. But I think it is generally, these represent how people should be, how they should be viewed, and how they should be thought of by people. So I'd like to just, as much as we can, kind of go through each of these qualifications and just discuss briefly what that means today. Some of these might require a little bit more conversation, and we may circle back to those next week. But just generally, what does it mean for a man to be above reproach or blameless?
One of these things that's hard to define. It's more
Yeah.
you know it when you see it, or you know it when you don't see it, I guess. But
Yeah.
but somebody that you can't obviously have a point of contention that this person's personality, this person's actions are clearly there's something I can clearly bring the blame at this person in there.
Yeah.
It could be somebody that nobody can find any fault with.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, someone that no one can find any fault with. I agree. But to me, this is one of those ones that is kind of challenging in that there's always going to be differences of opinion, differences in personalities, the way that people get along with one another. And I think this is kind of what I was talking about, in this process of being mindful of that we approach things in a thoughtful way. I think sometimes this evaluating if someone is above reproach requires setting aside maybe some personal differences of opinions, trying to evaluate if someone conducts themselves in the best way that they see fit, whether or not that disagrees with maybe a matter of opinion, or differences in personality. But I think in some ways this above reproach is sort of a thesis or a summary to at least some of the qualifications that come below it. But generally it's just a way that people carry themselves and their character.
I just Googled the definition of reproach.
Okay.
It's kind of and it speaks along the lines of disapproval or disappointment. So if someone's above that, there's nothing in their character that you can disapprove of or be disappointed in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's helpful. Number 2, faithful to wife, or husband of one wife. There's, I think, on one hand, fairly self-explanatory that man should not be adulterous. The man should not be, I believe, divorced and remarried. But one question that this will bring up from time to time is it required for an elder to be married? Could a widower be considered for an eldership? And that's a question that I personally don't hold a strong conviction on one way or another. I think that we do see from this and some qualifications further down that generally the man should be, I would say, a representative of God's design for a family. I think this is more focused on the way that the husband deals with his wife, his relationship with her. The fact that he is known to be respectable in that arena, and also kind of goes with the discussion that we'll get to about the expectations for him in regards to his family and his children. Any other thoughts or questions on this topic of faithful to his wife, or the husband of one wife?
I think a widower was a husband of a wife at one time, so he had that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know why that could not be
Yeah.
considered.
Yeah. Anyone online? Lisa said that a widower was a husband of one wife at one time, and he had that experience. And generally, I would agree with that. I also don't. I've known men that were widowers and did not feel that they were. They no longer felt comfortable with going forward to be appointed, and I also don't fault them for that if they personally hold that conviction as well. But anything else on that? Temperate. Anyone give what they think their definition of temperate would be?
Temper and self-control go hand in hand, not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, self-control, temperate, I think are pretty synonymous. I don't know if this is right or wrong, but for some reason I've always had this, temperate has always felt more like a personality trait, and self-control has maybe been more associated with like physically being able to resist temptations and stuff like that, whereas temperate, I don't know, at least in my mind, it seems to be associated with like not given to emotional outbursts or things of that nature. But I don't know, those are my thoughts at least.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that word because it can be taken in a lot of directions.
Yeah.
You know, you could think about extremism. You know, somebody that's temperate is not an extremist. You know, or you could think of it as they're not hot or cold as. I mean, they're. Or you could think of it as temperate as far as you might even think of it in terms of alcoholism. You know, somebody that's temperate. They're not on.
Right.
So I'm not sure how that word, honestly, is supposed to be applied. Maybe all of the above. I don't know.
As a general quality. That can apply to different situations as needed. I'm struggling. Can we go to 10:30 or 10:15? Oh, man. Okay, sorry, we are way past. I don't know why I was thinking 10:30.
You double check to see the clock was right.
Yeah, no, sorry. Didn't have my head on. All right, we will, continuing on these qualifications.
Sorry.